ENGN Preview Series, Episode 10, Champions of Hara with Walter Barber. Yo, my peoples, what's up? We are back with the Preview Series, the series of episodes that reaches straight into your wallet and doesn't pass go. So we have another Kickstarter preview for you. This preview is Champions of Hara, which is currently on Kickstarter, and we have our first repeat guest. Yes, he was on the regular show talking about Grimslingers and all the other Greenbrier releases, and now he is here to sell, and come and come right at trying to get right at you guys and get them to support your project. So without further ado, here is Walter Barber speaking for Champions of Hara. What's up?
Hey, Jason. Well, first of all, thank you so much for bringing me back for a second round of this. It's
first one, man.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really appreciate that, and the lengths you guys go to this Kickstarter and all the other Kickstarters and stuff you guys do is really awesome. So I really appreciate that. Yeah, we
have super fun, and I really feel like we're I mean, you get a lot of videos, but the videos tend to be kind of paid preview-ish stuff. You're not paying us for anything. I really like that we have a platform here to really tell some stories. We're going to talk about the game. We're definitely going to talk about Champions of Hara. But, like any game, it has an interesting story behind it, both it baked into the world itself and kind of the development of this game. So before we even get into that, how about you tell us a story? What you been up to recently?
Oh, God, banging my head against the computer with Kickstarter. In the fun way, in a good way. This one, I was saying a little bit before we started recording, this one more than ever is so personal to me. I mean, this game, I've been working on it for 5 years, and I've worked on several games since then with Greenbrier and otherwise and run other Kickstarters, but this one more than ever really feels like me just raw out on the internet, which the internet's a scary place. I don't know if you've ever been there, but
Yeah. I hear that they could say it's kind of mean things. They haven't studied their anger management manuals.
It's been shocking to me for this campaign, and it's still a modest campaign so far. We are funded, but still, it's been shocking to me that there has been absolutely zero negative feedback on the campaign.
Cool.
It's bizarre because, I'm used to regular Kickstarters where people are like, actually, I hate what you're selling. Get out of my face with this. But people have been so positive, and that's really cool when digging into the lore, and there's a lot of in Champions of Hara. There's a lot of content for people to get into. So it's been really cool getting some questions about some character backstories and stuff. And we've been doing these, just did the first one yesterday, and putting on the second one tonight after this, these spotlights on some of the characters that have been getting people excited. So it is nerve-wracking and anxiety-provoking, but it is very, very gratifying. So,
all right. So, but I do want you to tell that story because we had a launch. This is not the first time the gamers have heard of Champions of Hara, so we'll get into that. But let's just kind of start from the very beginning. What is this game?
Totally. So, Champions of Hara here's the tagline on Kickstarter: a funk fantasy tabletop adventure with both cooperative and versus gameplay. It's one way of saying it. Another way I was kind of phrasing it recently to someone is that it's really a lore-heavy arena game. So it's got some kind of MOBA-style elements, if you're familiar with that term. Oh, yeah. Everyone plays as one of the main characters in the story. They all have asymmetrical abilities, and that's one of the things the game's been most praised for so far is how asymmetrical the characters are. And you're moving around the map. In versus mode, it's really a race. You're trying to beat up the most monsters, go on the most little story events, and close these big rifts, which are just like pockets of energy, to try to gain energy before your opponents to kind of hit max power. And you've got a lot of ways to mess with people, but it's really this big race. And you are rewarded for fighting, but it's not really about fighting your opponents because the winner of that versus game that you play, that character has a choice of 2 branching stories that you can go into for cooperative mode. And these are big puzzles that's going to take everyone slam their heads together at the table to fight boss monsters that kick your butt. And yeah, so there's 6 main characters in the story, so that means there's 12 cooperative scenarios. Some of them sort of start cooperative and then end up being a one versus many situation or a team fight kind of thing. There are these branching paths that are these story arcs, and that's really where the meat of the game gets into.
Okay. So you said a buzzword, that buzzword being adventure. So I guess I'm kind of torn, and just looking around the Facebook feeds, not necessarily about this game, but about other quote unquote adventure games. There's excitement, and obviously, the adventure turns people's heads, but is it enough? There are adventure games just all over the place. It feels like, because Seventh Continent just delivered, and people are getting a second printing of Gloomhaven, and even Greenbrier has another adventure game, right? Folklore of the Affliction, which should be shipping out to backers really soon, or has that process already started?
That process is still going on. Yeah,
still going on. So yeah. And then I just saw Legends of Sleepy Hollow, another adventure game or ish, that was announced by Greater Than Games just today on Twitter. Tell me what your feelings about this. So like when a gamer says, is this enough? I can't, like, they just like tune it out. They're stuffed. It's like a buffet. They've filled their plate too much. You just can't even think of food anymore. So obviously not all gamers feel that way, but if somebody expresses that sentiment to you, how would you respond?
Well, that's kind of why I was giving you the caveat there, that it's really, in a lot of ways, it's more like a lore-heavy arena. So you're in sort of this closed environment. Hara is huge, but it is sort of set where it is. And it's less about like exploring through a story booklet and flipping over through all these chapters, and more about playing these individual scenario-based sessions. And so there's 7 different like flower boards that make up this map that are going to move around as you're going. The worlds are sort of unstable and they're shifting. And each of those zones has a different deck on it. And each of those decks is a story unto itself that you're only going to get like pieces of in each play session. And so you're really rewarded for doing these different scenarios, which are going to kind of tie into one another and into your experience with those different worlds, and then also into the graphic novel tie-in and things like that. So it's really it's trying to be, and I hope succeeding at being, this big transmedia kind of experience where you're getting little pieces as you go, but it's focusing on these sort of high octane like scenario battles. And it's more about that tactical combat than it is specifically about, a game like Folklore, where each individual encounter might not be that tactical in and of itself, but when you put the whole thing together, now you're looking at this big, long strategic campaign. There's no campaign in Champions of Hara the way that there is in Gloomhaven. It's these like, it's more like watching a Saturday morning cartoon than it is like watching a big epic movie, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. So like DuckTales Adventure, or
right.
I know I'm old.
You're sitting down for this closed session that is a story onto itself, and it's going to build to a greater narrative, but it's not so much tied to this whole like long campaign experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess there's different shades of adventure, and you're kind of going for, not lighter, but definitely heavier on the interactive side. Like, these two people clash and do battle, and they seek this thing, and then you're done, as opposed to this ongoing thing.
Right, more episodic, yeah.
Right, cool. All right. So yeah, I think that. And from the fact that you guys funded First Aid and the positivity coming up, I think enough gamers are kind of seeing what is unique about this game. So tell me a little bit about the story of the game itself. I mean, you mentioned before it's been in development for about 5 years. I noticed on the Kickstarter page, good old Undead Viking has a video from like 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's the first Kickstarter campaign. So maybe should I start with kind of the history of the game before?
Sure. Yeah, let's do it. Let's tell a story.
Okay, so it's kind of a long story to your listeners.
Let's tell a little bit of a short story.
the abridged version of it.
There you go.
So started making Champions of Hara my junior year in college, 2013. 20-year-old kid with some buddies. We kind of get obsessed with some game ideas. The narrative starts building around it. We work on it for a year, kind of ignoring all of our friends and the parties and things that a normal college person should be doing. In our senior year, we enter a business competition and win it and get some funding to like seed money for the art and to get the comic book going. A year later, we bring it to Kickstarter. It's sort of a small campaign. It's just the three of us, don't really know what we're doing. But we did fund successfully, which is great. So we got another round of it. Sorry, I skipped a step in there, which is that we went to Gen Con and started selling a mini version of the game and got some buzz off of that, which was great. And so the Kickstarter went. And then we went back to Gen Con and we were taking some pre-orders and we had kind of a full version of the game. And while we were there, someone came by our booth and started talking to us and told us about a designer publisher speed dating event that you had to sign up for and maybe we should try to get into. we found out that we were way too late. We were a year too late to sign up for it. So we showed up anyway and set up the game on a table outside with a big dumb sign that was like, we're looking for a publisher and we're cute. Come talk to us. And a couple publishers came by. One of them was Greenbrier Games. There are a few others, but that was the one that really like stuck. They were the most excited. They were the ones who got it. They picked up the comic book and they really were like, this is right. So we had a couple meetings with them. We were on a road trip out to Seattle. We ended up meeting my now boss, Jeff Gracia, in Colorado for fried chicken. And he was like, we're signing this deal today. Let's make it happen. And they were super supportive. They're basically like, we'll do whatever you want for this game. We'll put minis in it. We'll let you have all the dev time to do co-op. You can go nuts. It'll be great, but you have to wait to be in our development cycle. So that was kind of the trade-off. So we knew it was going to be about a year and a half wait. And so we told our Kickstarter backers that, and they were almost entirely in support of, hey, do whatever you want. You got to make it happen. There were a couple people who totally understandably were a little wary of, oh, you're making this, sort of big leap. But for the most part,
selling out
of people who were down and supported it. And then I made kind of another tough decision, which was in the beginning of 2016. I got a call from Jeff Gracia, who's the president of Greenbrier Games, saying we have an opening, and you can, we think that you're a smart young whippersnapper and that you're going to hustle and do a good job. So why don't you come aboard Greenbrier Games? That was absolutely phenomenal for me. I've since gotten to work on a bunch of their projects that we've talked about in that previous episode, which was great. Yep. The difficult decision came in when Stephen Gibson, a man I admire a lot, he's the creator of Grimslingers, the illustrator. He's the guy who did the redesign of all the beautiful art in Folklore and Apocalypse 2. He came onto the company. We made a tough decision, which was that we could have either done Champions of Hara without his art first, or Champions of Hara with his art, but later in the year. So we pushed it back another 6 months, and that's why it's out now as opposed to earlier this summer, so that Stephen Gibson could come onto the project and give it this whole fresh coat of paint that you see in the campaign right now, which is really just everything that I ever wanted it to be. So now I'm in this position where I've got the game exactly the way I always dreamed it was for like literally pushing 5 years now. But it has been quite the endeavor and quite a long time. But now we're here, and it's fun again. And since then, we had another opportunity to make a second chapter of the comic book and tell more of the story, which is great. So I guess we'll hop into that aspect of it.
Cool.
Champions of Hara Hara itself, if you watch a little video, describes it as being in the belly of the universe, beneath the roots of the tree of life. So it's this sort of lower spirit world. If you dig into it, it's really kind of an alternative afterlife. Like if the afterlife were crowdsourced, basically, where people are able to bring in their own elements from their own realities. And so it pulls people from all these different planets, essentially, into this one space. At their darkest moments. It's pulling in the downtrodden, the dejected, the rejects, outcasts from different worlds at their darkest moments and pulling them in here to this beautiful place, what feels like paradise. But by its very nature, by all these different forces bringing it into being, it is completely unstable. So you're playing on these 7 different boards, which are the 7 big continents that exist in this space. They're these floating islands. And so there are a bunch of smaller planes, but these are the biggest ones that you're moving across. And each one is its own totally unique area with lots of different backstory and things going on. But you're playing as one of these characters that's been brought in there, and you are tasked with trying to contain the energy that makes up Hara. It's this unstable force. There's 3 aspects of it. And you're trying to capture that within your being in order to keep everything from totally crumbling apart. If you look in the comic book, there is shots of like the islands that are just like basically exploding at random. And they need you, the people, the Kensei they're called, or the stewards of this place, are bringing in these people to try to contain this explosive energy. And they're going to reward you for your efforts by giving the person who's able to contain the most of it a single wish. And there are some stipulations to this wish, but for the most part, these Kensei have vowed to not interfere, and they'll let you wish for whatever you want. So that's where the co-op stuff comes in. Is first you play this versus mode to try to become the champion. to collect the most of this energy and prove that you're worthy. And if you succeed, you're given this wish, and that's where the two choices for a character come in. You've got two sort of preset wishes for your character that are path A or path B, and you choose one of those, and that's the cooperative experience that you have. But
so then, actually, I like to ask a gameplay question about that, because I don't know that I know a game where you're kind of, it sounds like you need to play the competitive in order to set yourself up for the co-op. It sounds like those two should be separate. I mean, they're two very different types of games.
So you can absolutely sit down and play any session, any scenario by itself.
Okay.
You can sit down and just play the versus. In fact, the game, for most of its development history, was just a versus game. That's the primary focus of the balancing and the different character abilities, is the competitive aspect of it. And that's the part that we've put the most energy into. The cooperative scenarios, you can sit down and play them in any order, but you are rewarded for sitting down and playing them more episodically by uncovering more of the narrative in a way that is going to be most engaging to you. And spoiler alert, because we're getting very close to it stretch goal wise, there's a small pack of legacy cards planned for the game. This is the lightest version of legacy. There's no stickers or anything, but it's a little sealed pack that'll come with the game, assuming we make a couple $1,000 more. And when you complete one of the scenarios for your character, it'll tell you to get a card from that pack. And that card is permanently for you as a player for playing that character. You can't use it in versus mode because we've worked really hard to balance everything that way. But you can use it for the cooperative mode. And so some of those cooperative scenarios will be marked as harder than others. And those would be these cards, which are really thematic. They're either like one-time use for a game or sort of these more mild passives for an experience.
It sounds like the beacons in Time Stories.
I actually have totally skipped over Time Stories. I see the box in the store, and I'm always tempted to buy it. What's your call? Should I buy it?
Well, that's my number 4 game of all time.
That's your number 4? I should do it? That's compelling. I'll do it.
It's an Asmodee game, so you're going to be in for some cost.
Right,
unfortunately,
that's been for me, yeah.
Yeah, because it's a one-shot game, and you got to buy the expansions and each scenario. But I haven't been upset about any of the scenarios. It's awesome. So what they have is these little beacons that you can earn after each mission, and they're basically one-time use little buffs that you can give yourself, or you can add more time, or you can get some health, you can get whatever, but you got to break them. And it actually says in the rule book, okay, you break them and they don't come back. And I don't know anybody that does that.
But that's awesome.
Yeah. Is that the kind of legacy thing you're talking about? Where it's
that's
like it's
the
in a
kind
pack?
of legacy thing we're talking about. We're not talking about like the Gloomhaven style legacy or things of that nature.
Okay, so a little bit of another wrinkle to add a little bit of a twist to the game. That's cool. So
I know what you want to hear most about, which is the solo aspects. Am I wrong?
Actually, before we get to the solo, what I really am interested in is the heroes. Like whenever believe me, we will get to the solo mode. But like hero gameplay, like you have so much of the lore around it, and you have this mythology around like the champions, and that all sounds really cool. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't deliver gameplay wise, then I'm playing a comic book or whatever it is. So along with the interesting story, there is an interesting little mechanism that you have, and the thing that I'm attracted to is the card play. So I love Mage Knight. Mage Knight is my number 1 solo game of all time, and it's all driven by card play. So it seems like it's the same way, only you have a little bit of a twist to it. So maybe you can tell us about the twist you've put on.
Totally. So Mage Knight, huge influence. Obviously, anyone who's played Mage Knight can see the pieces here in Hara. Sure. So every character has a totally different resource mechanic, but on top of that, they all share one common system, which is the cards, as you talked about. So everyone has a little set of cards. You start with 4 of those cards. They're marked as your little starter core cards, and you're going to have the rest in a deck that you level up into. Each card has a top and a bottom ability. When you use a card from your hand, you activate the top part of the ability, and then it sits on the table in front of you. And on a subsequent turn, you can pick that card back up from the board and use the bottom part of the ability. So you're cycling through sort of 2 aspects of these cards. You can use 3 a turn. You start with 4 options. You can use 3 of them on a turn. So you've got 4 cards, but it's really 8 options because you've got the tops and the bottoms of them. And then as you level up, you're going to gain access to more abilities that you add into this larger hand. And so each character has a different resource mechanic that those cards are going to reference. Either that's the cost that you're spending to use those abilities, or that's something you build to unlock more of them. So let's just look at a couple of these core characters. We've got Persephone, who was the subject of a recent Spotlight update. So everyone, presumably who's listening to this, has seen that on the campaign here. But her mechanic is about fear. She's from a world that is totally lightless. It's a dark planet, except for these like horrible anglerfish raptors that run around trying to eat her people. And she's about to totally get eaten when Hara swoops her up and brings her here. And here, now in this beautiful place where people are able to access magic, she is able to control that fear, and it turns into this sort of shadowy monster behind her, and she's able to kick people's butt. But basically, as she takes damage, her health will go down, but her fear meter will go up. And then she's going to pass 2 thresholds on that fear meter. There's a scared and a terrified. And as you pass those thresholds, you're going to unlock little bonuses on those abilities that you're playing that will reference whether you're scared or terrified or both, and let you pay the fear that you've been building up to activate extra effects on your powers.
What was that Disney movie, Inside Out? Or it was like, you had the little shy little monster and the matter you made her, and it's like, oh no, she's gonna blow.
Yes, similar, only a little bit more murderous. Okay, so that's her, and sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Auric, who's going to be a subject to the next spotlight. Auric's mechanic is all about these changing animal stances. He's a martial artist, which is a bit of a pun because he, does martial arts, but also does regular art. He's this whole painter vibe going on with his stuff. But he's got 3 animal stances, and every turn you have to pick a new stance. You can't stay in the same stance, and each stance gives you a buff for your character and a penalty and a debuff. So like Tiger Stance lets you do extra damage, but it reduces your range. Koi Stance gives you an extra activation, but you take a ton of extra damage. Crane Stance gives you more range, but lowers your movement capabilities. So you've got these pros and cons, but then the abilities that he actually has to work with play into those in what I feel are very interesting ways, where sometimes the thing that the Crane Stance, for example, which gives you extra range but reduces your movement, could sometimes actually help you reposition yourself better, because some of his powers involve targeting with range to jump to that space instead of regular movement. So you got to kind of like look at these little combos and those abilities. Or Koi, for example, though you take extra damage, and that's bad because you don't have that much health, he's got a power that when he takes more damage, he's building up a little thing that he's going to be able to kind of redirect at people. So you're sort of cycling through these pros and cons. And that's kind of one of the big things about Hara, is this sort of emergent strategy. So the board is kind of constantly changing, whether the actual physical tiles are moving around or new cards are coming out, but you need to constantly adapt and look at the combos that you have in your hand and come up with these on the fly new strategies for what you're going to do.
Okay. So then getting back to the playing the cards and all that kind of stuff, I guess I was a little bit worried because it sounds like, okay, you play a card, but you don't get the action now, you get the action later, I suppose. But it's not like a time bomb effect where it's like you play it and you get the top thing on turn 1 and you get the bottom thing on turn 2 and then it comes back. It stays there and then you choose whether you want to activate it or not and put it back in your hand. Is that correct?
Right. You make a new choice. So if on my first turn, I've got 4 cards in my hand and I play 3 of them, I use the top parts of those 3 cards and they sit in front of me. And on another turn, I have the 3 cards that are in front of me. I have the bottom abilities of those cards, and then I have the top ability of the card that's still in my hand. So I still have 4 abilities to choose from. And I'm going to pick 3 of those and sort of cycle through that in whatever ways are most useful for that given time.
And then there's a deck building aspect where you can improve those cards. Is it going to be like a bigger hand, or is it, you draw through and discard stuff, or is it kind of, how does it work?
It's all hand building. So you're never like drawing random cards. You always have a set of abilities, and you're going to. So each character is building up 3 basically experience bars. Mm-hmm. And at certain points in those bars, you're going to get access to your level up deck. So when you level up in red, for example, your character you're gonna pull up your little deck of cards, and you're gonna have 2 red cards to choose from your character that you're gonna select one of them and then add it to your hand. So you're not replacing a card that you already had. Now you have access to 5 cards. You still only can use 3 of them on a turn unless you found an ability or an item or whatever that lets you maybe do more. But in general, you can only use 3 abilities on a turn.
So that actually, the way you describe that, it reminds me. Have you played BattleCon from Level 99?
I have. I'm actually a big fan of the whole series.
It feels like, cause it's funny because you mentioned the MOBA, like that's kind of a fighting game too, and it has that constant hand. I wonder if that's like the fighting and having that constant hand where you're cycling through tactics and stuff like that, if that just melds together, you know?
Right. I mean, and it's not completely dissimilar than the system in Gloomhaven where you're combining the top and the bottom of 2 cards, except for this is like a little bit more abstract in a way, in that so you're putting these cards in front of you and then you've got to kind of think about, like you said, so it's not a time bomb like you were saying where you have to like, okay, I've put this card down, it's definitely going to happen next turn. But you got to think about, if I use this part of the ability this turn, then I'll only have access to the other part of the ability until I use it again, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Because when I first saw it, I thought, I was like, oh no, it's programming. It's going to happen 3 turns later, like Colt Express. I'm like, no. But the way you described it, that makes it a lot clearer. Thank you.
Right. Well, the board itself, the map around you, there's going to be so many more inputs on every turn that it couldn't really be programming. As though I do like some action programming games, because it's really about this emergent strategy that you're like, okay, on a new turn, I got to try to, get the most points either by going over here, over there. It would be very frustrating for it to be programming. Yeah. So,
So you're mentioning this circular board. Now that we're talking about the heroes a little bit, let's talk about the world itself, this living world. There's monsters, there's event cards, there's all sorts of like kind of stuff bubbling up to fuzzy up, the tactics and all that kind of stuff. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
So on each of these worlds, there's 6 spaces, and in the center of that world, so 6 spaces around a center space, and in that center space sits a deck of hex cards, and those are either monsters or events. Every day, and the day is made up of 2 rounds, cards are going to come out from those decks onto the different spaces of that world. If they're a monster, they're going to come out face up, and you're going to know entirely what you're dealing with. And if it's an event, it's going to come out face down. But the event cards themselves give you some clues on the back of them to what energy you could get in that world. So you're not going in totally blind. And the events will always give you something good. So you'll always be at least a little bit rewarded for going to deal with one of those stories. Then you read a little piece of flavor, or skip it if you so choose. And then you're either going to be given a choice of 2 things that you can do, or some of them have a challenge roll. So each character, in addition to their own separate resource, there's another common resource, which is spirit, which is tracked next to your health. And spirit is what you use to deal with these events and rifts, which we'll talk about in a second. When you go to an event, it might say, after you read a little bit of flavor, it might be like, challenge rating 7, pay spirit, and then roll will be the instruction it'll give you. And so in that case, you need to get a total of 7. You're going to roll that die, and whatever amount of spirit that you paid will be added to your roll, trying to get to 7. So you've got a bit of a gamble when you see that. You're like, how badly do I want to, succeed at this event? How bad would failure be for me? And then you're going to pay an amount of spirit and then roll that die and combine the amount of spirit you paid with the result of your die roll. And if you meet the challenge rating, you succeed, and you'll read whatever the success part of this card is. And if you fail, you'll read the fail part of the card.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So you've got this like luck mitigating element, that it's not just I land on a card and whatever happens to me happens to me. It's you're going to land on a card and you're going to have some ability to affect what's happening to you.
So I mean, it's what I'm hearing is like it's a deck, and so a deck of cards has inherent randomness in it. You don't know if it's going to be an event or a monster. There's the shifting board itself. Are gamers going to think like, oh man, this might be like a real random fest or whatever?
Well, so the monsters will always come out face up, and there are significantly more monsters than these events.
Okay.
And so those are the devil basically, and you can always go after a monster. And then there's another type of card that comes out face up, which are these rifts. And rifts are just candy. They're just pockets of energy. They're just good. Nothing bad can happen to you on a rift. You do have that whole system of paying spirit and trying to roll a die, etc. But they're just good, and so there's something that people race to. And so you've got these like, big scary monsters that you might be trying to avoid until you get more powerful. These smaller monsters that you're like, okay, perfect, that's who I'm going to take out to, get some items or get some more energy or what have you. And then you've got these rifts, which are big, like, okay, first person there is going to get a big chunk of points. That's great. So you've got those elements that you're always going to be able to see and know about. And then you've got your hand of cards to deal with them that isn't random. So it's the board and the environments are random, but your abilities, your agency as a character is never random. And so you always know what you are capable of.
Got it. Cool. And the monsters themselves, are they like rampaging monsters across the countryside, or are like the mage knight kind of standing there in the way, kind of loot baggy type approach?
So we have two kinds. The majority are much more like the mage knight monsters that are sitting there. They're either going to kick your butt until you get more powerful, or they're there to get their butts kicked by you. Then,
big fat ogre with like a chicken leg.
Right. Or there are the corrupted, which are the big bosses. They are, giant 40 millimeter minis. And these are the centerpiece of the cooperative mode. And they're basically, in the lore, they were champions. They were people who were here with good intentions that throughout their time in Hara became totally, I can't think of the word exactly, but they get burnt out with their experience, and they become the villains over time. And so you're dealing with these big badasses, and those are the guys that totally move around the map. They've got each have their own set of abilities that all have different targeting systems, so they'll pick a character and go after them. And based on the different scenarios that you're in, you've got different objectives. You may be trying to keep them away from something, or just trying to take them down, or trying to take them down while also looking for something else, or trying to prevent something from getting overrun, managing these different worlds. And so there's always going to be kind of two things for you to focus on: the big bad guy who's kicking your butt, and the other objective that you have to deal with. So you got to keep your finger on two triggers, if that makes sense, when you're in cooperative.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So in terms of tactics, like the actual tactics with which you approach monsters and events and stuff like that, is it like tactical movement? Like, is there kind of a dynamic, like, okay, I move 2, move 3, juking and driving, or is the tactics more that card play type thing?
So everything you want to do, basically the answer to that is both. Everything you want to do is using your abilities. There's no like passive, I get to move space a turn, whatever. Everything you want to do is from the text of the cards in your hand. And those cards will say things like move 2, move 1, move 3, deal 2 damage, range 0, deal a damage, range 1 kind of thing. So the space you're on being range 0. And so you're going to have these abilities that let you target monsters that are either near you or far away from you, or let you move around, etc. And then monsters have different keywords. Some of them prevent you from attacking them at range, so you have to get up in their grill unless you're a character who can maybe melt their armor, for example. So I guess the answer to that is both, that it's really about this tactical positioning on this grid, but that it's also about, okay, I know what I can do on these cards, and I see what that monster needs for it to be defeated, and I know what it's going to give me as a reward, so I'm going to make my choices that way. So it's kind of a two-pronged tactic.
Yeah, so we covered heroes, we covered monsters. I feel like we've sufficiently covered the game itself, unless there's some other aspects of it which you really need to get in.
I'll just quickly toss in how items work. So items are never random. They're always a direct relation to something that you did in the game. So when you beat a monster, it'll in its rewards, it'll tell you what type of experience points you gain, and then it might show you in a little item bag an item number. So there's an item deck off to the side that's never shuffled, and all the backs of that deck are numbered. So you know what you're going to get. You pull it out, and you have that for your character. And that's either a piece of equipment that stays with you, or a one-time use discard item. And those are things that you get either from fighting monsters, or that you might get as rewards in the story. But they're always this like one-to-one relationship.
I think it was Stephen Bauer on his video was like, these items are so cool. It's like, I'll take your word for it, buddy.
I did appreciate how enthusiastic Bauer was about the items.
Yeah.
Well, because the old system back in the day, the items were random. They used to just be with the event cards. It was, oh, you found an item. Great, it's yours. And now I think it's a much more satisfying system of, oh, you beat that big badass. Well, you get to take his shoes and wear them. Or you took the sword out of his hand and now it's yours. And it feels like a lot more direct in a cool way.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And that is not it. I mean, you're alluding to the graphic novel, and there's also an expansion for the game. And so it just seems like this is the beginning, or the reboot, or however you think of it, of a much larger initiative that's going to be coming forth. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what you're buying into.
Right on.
This is the gateway to something else.
So we dropped an expansion with it right out the gate. which I'm very enthusiastic about because I love the expansion characters. The expansion is really a character and story addition. It doesn't add more worlds to it per se. It adds 4 more playable characters, each of them having 2 scenarios for that character, and then 3 more of the big badass bosses, some more cards to fill out the world decks, because it also adds 2 more playable seats. It adds 2 more player boards and some more bits that you can play with up to 6 people. And then it comes with these other really cool translucent minis that are part of the different cooperative scenarios that come with those different characters. And one thing I really like about some of the ones that we have written so far for that are that they add this one versus many element. And so there's a couple different ways that happens, but basically it involves one player becoming corrupted, and all of a sudden you were a team and now you're not, kind of reminiscent of House on Haunted Hill, which I really love. So I love that facet of it. And then we have, like you're talking about, the graphic novel. So I'm hesitant to call it a totally graphic novel because right now we just have 2 chapters. So I'm referring to these as graphic shorts. They're each about 10 pages, and they're going to dig into the backstory of some of the characters, starting with the main core characters, the 6 there. So the first one's about Thomas Evening. He's the only human in this world. He gets pulled out of 18th century London. He's like an inventor who's way ahead of his time. He gets thrown in jail for accidentally blowing up a city block, and he's sort of, I don't come out and say this very explicitly, but he's about to kill himself in jail when Hara swoops him out and brings him here, and he goes on his big adventure. So it kind of starts with him, and he's a good sort of narrator point because, we understand how humans think, and so he's a good focus for that. And then this new chapter that we just put out, which I'm really excited about, is about Karu. Karu and Kuma. Kuma is the bear companion to Karu. Karu's from a world of sort of this masculine-driven world of barbarians where all the men are hunters, and they go on this trial of manhood to get a bear pet that they're going to hunt with. But Karu, during that trial, unfortunately, as the runt of the litter, is maimed. He gets attacked by a monster and loses his left arm, and the village does not handle it very well. His mom is very sweet to him, and he has memories of that in the comic. He has this like flashback to his mom being kind to him, but he's sort of dealing with this kind of fractured psyche of this toxic masculinity. And when he comes to Hara, he has this amazing gift of using Hara's magic. He's very talented, and he's a geomancer. He controls rocks, and he builds himself this badass Hellboy-style new hand, and sort of inadvertently creates an imaginary friend for himself. This rock bear is kind of like Hobbes to his Calvin. He doesn't even necessarily fully consciously know isn't real. And they go on this series of misadventures, and he's kind of a sad, lonely kid until he meets some of the other characters and kind of has this new definition of himself. He's here to kind of redefine I'm not just this wimp who wasn't allowed to, be a man in my life. I have this new definition of me here in Hara, and Hara is really about these people, the dejected folks from these different walks of life coming and finding agency for the first time.
Mm-hmm. I got to tell you, the lore is overqualified for a board game.
That's sort of, it's always been standing on these pillars that the board game. I think board games are one of the best ways, the best medium for telling a story because it is so interactive. But I want the graphic novel to totally stand on its own. So we've got 2 little chapters out right now. We're hopefully, fingers crossed, going to be putting out a 3rd before the end of the year. That might be more like early 2018, all in the hopes of eventually sort of moving on from these backstory little vignettes to a more linear, full, what's happening in the present of Hara narrative.
And one last thing, Walter. This is a Solo Games podcast. We are Every Night is Game Night, known for solo play. Tell us a little bit about solo play in Champions.
So we're like $2,000 away from the solo stretch goal. And so this is something I'm excited about.
One player guild, go get them.
Because this is something I'm really excited about because I, obviously, as a game designer, spend a lot of time sitting in front of board games solo, trying to play them or play multiple characters in a lot of games. To try to get some pieces of it, or especially in the testing and design process, I ended up sort of making a bunch of solo scenarios just so I could test some of the basics of the game. So I'm really excited to finally be able to put them in and have the graphics for them made and stuff like that. But basically, there's one main one for each character, and then there's a couple that you can play with any character. But really the ones I'm excited about are the ones that are specific to a character. So the one that I'm going to record on Tabletop Simulator this weekend and put out for people is Oryx's solo scenario, where Persephone gets kidnapped by Ophion, the big scary boss, and brought to this place in the Drear. And so you start on opposite ends of the map as her, and Ophion's in the middle. And you've got to try to basically defend yourself from Ophion, beat up these other monsters in order to get enough energy to bring to her to free her, and then you're going to have to be able to pick her up and bring her back. But this whole time, Ophion's trying to beat you up. He's spawning little dudes who are sort of walking towards her. And so you've got your setup as Oryx, and Oryx's one of the more complicated characters anyway to play as. So you've got a lot of decisions to make on your own based on what's going on there. Then you've got Persephone's set up over to the side where you're going to be tracking what's happening to her. And her character is all about how she takes damage, she gains fear. And so she's taking damage from these things that you've got to manage, because if she gets defeated, you're going to lose the scenario. You can get defeated once, you've got an extra life. But if she gets defeated, you're totally out. And Ophion's got these abilities where he's either going to teleport to people or pull them towards him. And you've got a choice every time he uses one of them. Do you want him to hit you, or do you want him to hit her? If she goes down, you're totally out. But as she builds fear, she's going to give you, the player, access to your ultimate ability. So you kind of you've got all these different things that you have to manage and keep your eyes on. But ultimately, the systems at work are still what I believe to be these clean and simple choices that you're making.
Does the solos differ significantly from the co-op?
It doesn't differ significantly from the co-op, except that the co-op scenarios that are written for the game right now that you play in these story arcs are really specifically designed with a minimum of 2 players involved, whereas these create this other element, so to speak, that you need to manage, that make them really designed that you couldn't play them with 2 people, because they're really about one person's choices.
Mm-hmm. So is it like a balancing issue? Like, okay, there's this many quote unquote points of enemies in the solo versus cooperative, or is there something more mechanical going on in the background?
I think it is. It's primarily balanced, but also it's primarily just the nature of those objectives involve something that you're going to want to. You could play all those characters as one person, but you could play all of those scenarios as one person, but you'd have to play 2 characters. Mm-hmm. And manage 2 characters worth of hands. And that's something that I'm not really into in solo games, where it's like you can play the solo, but it just means you're 2 players sitting down, as opposed to something that's specifically designed for you to play as one person, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's nothing in the rules stopping you from holding 2 hands of cards and doing all of that as one player. But for me, I feel like that's kind of a cop-out for a solo game. Whereas
you are not alone with that one, man.
I want it to be this specifically okay, you're on a mission that's designed for this character for you to do on your own. And so obviously they're all, like all things Hara, they're all really tied to the lore, but specifically the mechanical intrigue is sort of geared towards one person versus a group of people managing a bunch of different things and making different decisions together as a team.
Yeah. Like, it's funny because in the guild, every couple of months or so, there'll be a thread what is a solo game? Solo versus solitaire. Can you play chess solo? Did that count? Or, the multi-handed, so Sentinels of the Multiverse, a Pandemic. The optimal experience of that game is 3 or 4, and people are like, oh, that's not solo, that's solo. So it kind of gets into a big argument and people go back and forth. And then some voice of reason will say, okay, all right, one character, one goal, here we go.
Yeah. I stand by that. I mean, that's not to say that in testing a lot of games like Grimslingers or Zeepak and Folklore is a game where you can play it solo, but you play as 2 characters, and it's actually fun, in my opinion, to play as 2 characters, because you're not holding 2 hands. You've got these 2 guys set up together, and it's there's space on the board versus you kind of holding all these pieces.
Yeah, I think that's it. When you're playing multiple characters, you can multiple characters, but only one hand, you can kind of get yourself in the single headspace of a commander commanding their troops. So you're moving one person here, but it's not 3 different commanders, because you're not holding 3 different sets of resources, whether it's cards or a bag of chips or whatever it is.
Totally.
So it sounds like what you're doing in Folklore is just, okay, here's the warrior and the elf, and they're all a shared bag of loot,
right?
Shared activation. So yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow. So you're so basically when you look at this game, Champions of Hara, and you see that word adventure, and it's like, okay, why should I buy this? I mean, it kind of obscures a lot of different things that are going on. First of all, there's this really, really rich lore world, and that's going to be a really subjective thing, right? You either love the lore or you're not into it or whatever it is. So I think that if you're kind of on the fence about it, there is a lot there. Like I'm looking at this art is just, it's really, really nice. You know, way nicer than a lot of like this is like a cut above a lot of what you see in these kind of board game lore type things. That is really cool. You could stand on its own as an indie comic, in my opinion. So the art is amazing. The lore is really well thought out and emotional, that kind of stuff. And you get 5 years of gameplay, design.
And I will say, a lot of people. I'm sort of the head of this, but I've worked with a lot of really amazing people on this project. We've had a lot of different developers come in and help out. We've had a bunch of different blind playtest leads, which has been great and a little scary. Actually, we're working with Mighty Boards, who are the creators of Vengeance and Petrichor and Pesheman. These really amazing guys. Yeah. And this will be the first time, I think, for any Greenbrier title that one of our games has gone into international blind playtesting. So we're working with Mighty Boards to bring, I think it's 4, really, I'm actually really scared about this, 4 blind playtesting international group. People who don't speak English necessarily as their first language are going to be like totally chewing up the rule book and making sure that the graphics stand on their own as just purely visual explanation of stuff. So it's really going to be hammered on by the very end, and I'm very excited for that.
Very nice. So, yeah, I mean, and I think the MOBA style kind of gives it a little bit of a pop in terms of, you know, it's not just like, you know, go to city A or go to cave B or dungeon C. And, you know, there is like this more like kind of interactive back and forth, and it has that, but with a tactical Mage Knighty flair. So you know, I think you sold it in terms of like at least what's different, you know, and I think that's what this series episode is all about. Is okay, so many projects out there. How is this different? And you know, I think you know, day one funding is not something to be taken for granted. So you know, I just hope that you guys can unlock your stretch goals, and I look forward to playing it.
I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, man. This has been awesome.
All right, thank you very much. And that's going to do it for another episode of the ENGN preview series. We would like to thank our first repeat guest, Walter Barber. Hopefully the first of many repeat guests as we get more and more friends around the solo gaming community, game design community who wants to come in here and preview their Kickstarters. Come on down. We are willing to help out, especially those who are, you know, not the big companies. Y'all don't need help. Simon doesn't need any help. But Greenbrier Games and Button Shy Games and all y'all who are doing Kickstarters and building communities, come on down. We'd love to help as much as we can. So that's going to go ahead and do it. Please, please, please rate our podcast on iTunes and on SoundCloud and Stitcher and wherever you get your podcast from. You can contact us on the Twitter at ENGN_podcast. You can also hit us up on Facebook, either through the Board Gamers Anonymous community site or just catch me lurking on the solo Facebook group guild. You can also catch me on the one player guild on BGG. And basically, wherever you look, wherever there's board gaming happening, go ahead and hit us up and join the fun. So that's going to do it for another episode. Later, everybody.